How great are you, Yah? How great is your mercy? How great are the things you have done for me? How great are you, Yah? Your loving kindness is filling my heart as I sing. How great are you, Yah? How great is your love? It reaches to
And you shall
the
observe
heavens.
this word for an ordinance for you and for your sons forever. And it shall be, when you come into the land which Yahuwah shall give to you as he has spoken, you shall observe this service. Observe it by guarding and protecting it, as it says in the Hebrew. Well, here we are. The Passover season is upon us. Passover, the 14th of Abib. Today we're going to be talking about a subject between the evenings, or Ben Ha Arbayim. We're also going to look into the domestic household Passover sacrifice today. We're grateful to be here. We want to honor our Father in heaven by starting this presentation with a prayer. Our Father, holy is your name. Holy is your name. We come before you, Yahuwah, and honor you this Sabbath day in the Passover season, and we look forward to your kingdom coming to this earth. Oh, how we need your kingdom on this earth. We pray that your will be done as it is in heaven. We're grateful that you continue to feed us your word of truth as well as our daily physical food, but we are honoring you this day and ask you to keep us safe, protect us from the evil that's all around, protect us from the world's oppression that's closing in on mankind, and we look forward to your kingdom coming, and we look forward to the return of Yeshua coming in power and glory. So we honor you and pray to you now in Yeshua's name. Amen. Well, greetings to all. Greetings to all during the beginning of this Passover season. We're not quite to Passover yet. We have a few more days, but on this Sabbath day, we're going to start with a presentation series, which will include parts 5, 6, 7, and 8 on this agenda. And we have made presentations on this in past years. The first 4 parts are already recorded and complete on our website, but today we're going to start with a new series that will start with what I'm calling here part 5. We originally had a presentation that was called Feast of the Jews, which is now marked part 7 on this agenda, and I was going to redo that presentation. There was new material available that I had been wanting to get to the last several years, and I just didn't. And finally this year, I started last December to work on this, and I was just going to do the one presentation. However, as I started adding the material, it actually morphed into 4 separate parts. So part 5, 6, 7, and 8, it's all new material. There's some repeat material in part 7 because that was the foundation of what I started with. But I've been wanting to get to this subject of when is the Passover. If you keep the Passover, you know very likely, if you kept it for very many years, that there's a controversy of what night you keep it on. And is there such a thing as the Lord's Supper or the Last Supper? And when you start researching this, you find out that it's quite a controversy, and there's lots of different opinions on it. So I've talked to people about it and read effectively was a mountain of material on both sides of the equation, by the way, not just on one side or the other. I like to look at all sides of the matter. And the material that's come out that I put into this presentation is a summary of all that I've been thinking about the last several years, and then the last several months, the research that's been being done. So we're going to start with part 5 today, And it has somewhat of an unusual title, Between the Evenings, or Ben Ha Arbayim. And if these aren't familiar terms to you, you may say, well, why does it matter? Well, we want to keep the Passover on the correct day, and we want to honor Yahuwah and Yeshua by observing the Passover in the best way that we possibly can. So I've looked into detail in what this term between the evenings is all about, and it turns out that it's quite a controversy. So today we're going to look at between the evenings. We'll look at when is the Passover. There's something called the 14th, 15th controversy, depending upon what your background is. So there'll be information about that. We'll decide when Ben Ha Arbayim is. Actually, the scriptures tell us when it is. It's pretty remarkable that it's right there in front of us. And also, I'm going to introduce a term that I don't think you find in the scripture, but it has to do with, is the Passover a domestic household Passover sacrifice? Was that what it was originally? And did it get changed, or was it modified? Did Yahuwah modify it along the way to become a temple sacrifice? So we're going to take a look at that group of material today. Next week, actually on the first day of unleavened bread, which will be Thursday, the topic will be at even, and that topic in Hebrew is Ba'arev. And so the complement to Bein Ha Arbayim and understanding it is understanding the other part of what the evening is all about, which is called Ba'arev. So we'll detail that next Thursday. So if you want to get the fullness of this, today's presentation is the beginning, and next Thursday it completes the analysis of what is this term between the evenings. And then going on to a week from today on the weekly Sabbath, I'm going to present the original topic with a lot of new material in it, which is called the Feast of the Jews. Something you find in several places in John. We'll talk about it briefly today. What did John mean by the Feast of the Jews? And you find the Passover, the Feast of the Jews. You find Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of the Jews mentioned. And in several places, only in the book of John, by the way. So we're going to highlight that in part 7, as well as take a detailed, close look at Yeshua's Passover and the new covenant that he established. The new covenant, not the renewed covenant, but the new covenant. When you look at what Yeshua said, he used the Greek word for new, meaning brand new, not new depending upon the age. So we'll look at those Greek words and do a comparison about the new covenant when we get to part 7. And then I've just keep running into this other extended controversy. Not only is there a controversy on should the Passover be the 14th or the 15th, there's a controversy after you get into the first few centuries CE, after Yeshua's death. The early church had people pushing to keep the Passover on Sunday. They called it the Lord's Day. And you see one example in Revelation about the Lord's Day. So we're going to examine that in part 8, which will be on the last day of unleavened bread. We're going to examine how the Passover was changed by human hands to be a Sunday, and then how it was renamed to Easter. So that's what's coming over the next week, 10 days during Passover season, or the days of unleavened bread. And you'll note that I'll use the terms interchangeably because most of the commentators do that. And going back to Josephus and Philo and a number of the old historical writers, they use the terminology interchangeably. The scriptures, by the way, use it interchangeably. So we're going to look at all of that. But today we're starting with what is called part 5 in the series, and this will be all new material, Between the Evenings. Now, I always like to write down for myself what's the purpose and objective of what I'm doing here. And there's really 8 items that I want to accomplish over the next 4 presentations. One is an examination of the history of the Passover institution itself. So if if you keep the Passover and have kept it on the 14th or the 15th, you're going to find that there's a whole nother side to the story of why people keep it on different days. We're also going to look in detail to these two terms, Ben Ha Arbayim and Ba Arev. You may think, well, who cares? Well, I think Yahuwah cares. He made it very crystal clear to Moses that he cared and said when the original Passover was, and we'll get to that here shortly. So we're going to look at the difference in those two expressions. Turns out that those two expressions in English aren't differentiated. So I'll talk a little bit about that shortly. We're going to compare the domestic household Passover that was originally instituted back in Exodus with the first and then ultimately the second temple Passover practices. So you'll see that and learn about that as we go through. I've just been amazed to find the historical records and what it says about these two alternatives, the original household Passover versus the temple Passover. And we're going to be looking at that. And of course, in the process, we're going to survey all the Old Testament, New Testament Passover related scriptures. And then I've already mentioned that this usage, the Jews' Passover or the Feast of the Jews, is something we will examine in a later part of the series, the words that John used. And why is he the only one that said that, by the way? And we're going to investigate that in some amount of detail. And in the process, of course, we're going to highlight Yeshua's Passover in 30 CE. I mean, that's the main event here. All the rest of this is material that really points to and leads up to it. And of course, we'll take a look at the New Covenant Contract Gospel accounts. There are 3 accounts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that are harmonized for us very precisely and neatly in the scriptures. We'll take a look and compare those accounts. And finally, we will analyze the evolution of the institution of Passover, how it became Easter in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century church. So a pretty good set of objectives. And today, though, we'll be looking at the first 3, examining the history and looking at the difference between Ben Ha Arbayim and Ba Arev, although we're going to only look at Ben Ha Arbayim today. Next session, we'll look at the other side of this, the Ba Arev side. And we'll start to understand that there was something that I would title the domestic household Passover. So let's get started. So where do we start here? Well, let's start back where Yahuwah told the Israelites and is telling us to keep these holy days, to keep his appointments. And that's back in Leviticus 23, of course, where all of the holy days are listed for us in one nice chapter. Of course, the chapter break wasn't originally there. It just turns out that man's librarian system has numbered it to be Leviticus 23. And what Yahuwah said is, Yahuwah spoke unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them concerning the feast of Yahuwah, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, even these are my feast. A couple of points about this. These are Yahuwah's feast. These aren't man's feast. The feasts of Yahuwah, these are the ones that he detailed. And by the way, these aren't the feast of the Jews. Speak unto the children of Israel. And I've said many times, all Jews are Israelites, but not all Israelites are Jews. There was 12 tribes, and you don't know much about that. It's a good subject to look into, but the children of Israel were the audience here through Moses that was being spoken to. And of course, the first one that you see is remarkable to be the weekly Sabbath. And then after that, we go into what would be the annual cycle, starting with the Passover, the days of unleavened bread, Pentecost or Shavuot, as it would be in Hebrew, trumpets, which we would call Rosh Hashanah, Atonement, Yom Kippur, the Feast of Tabernacles or the Feast of Booths, and then the final standalone day, which is called the 8th day. So these are the feasts that are outlined in Leviticus 23. Now, sometimes we talk to people that really don't know much about these holy days. They may be mainstream Christians, and they keep Easter and Christmas and the mainstream holy days, and really don't know that there was originally a set of days that Yahuwah wanted us all to keep. And it's amazing when you talk to people, this seems somewhat like a mystery to them that they hadn't heard before. And I got to thinking about that. And when you look up the word mystery, and particularly in the New Testament, you see that there are really quite a number of mysteries that are outlined in the scriptures. And in Mark 4:11, it says, and he, and this is Yeshua speaking, said unto them, unto you it is given to know the mystery of the kingdom of Yahuwah. But unto them that are without, all these things are done in parables. So this is a great topic to think about. It's a mystery to many people that these holy days are really outlined in the scriptures. They're not a set of Roman and Greek alternatives that you can say are scriptural. And when we get to looking at Easter, what you find is that in the early church, the Gentiles took over the rulership, and they started looking allegorically at the scriptures and coming up with their own interpretations. And what I discovered when I looked at this as I was developing the presentation is there's there's zero scriptural basis for their reasoning to change the Passover to Easter. It's really amazing to look at. Clement or Irenaeus or Tertullian, none of them said, according to the Gospel of Mark, it says we should do thus and such. And none of that is there. It's just all human logic. So these are mysteries to some people, and hopefully one day, I know one day all will understand the significance of these appointments. So with that little bit, let's talk about, for one chart here, what was the genesis of this presentation, and what's a little bit of the background about it. And I'd already mentioned the original presentation I did several years ago was about the Feast of the Jews and Yeshua's Passover. And since then, actually over about the last 4 or 5 years, Linda and I have talked to some number of people and listened to, by recommendation of others, some large group of presentations by others that tried to make the case that the Passover was really the 15th and not the 14th. And one individual had a real intricate model that he made, a wooden model where you could move the days around and move the events around with little blocks. It was really pretty well done, nice model, but his focus was trying to prove with his model that the 15th was when the original Passover really was. And this all has to do with accounts in Josephus and some of the historical record that we know to be true, that the sacrifice of the lambs in Yeshua's time was largely taking place at the temple in a mass production kind of a line, and that was happening in the afternoon of the 14th. At the same time, Yeshua was crucified and died. So the case is made that Yeshua fulfilled all of these sacrifices that were being done at the temple. The question is, should they have been being done at the temple to start with, and how did that happen? So that's what we have set out to take a look at here. And this first scripture in John that talks about this was the Passover, a feast of the Jews was near. And we will get to the end, to the depths of this particular scripture when we get to the part 7, I believe it is, and we'll examine it. Now, there's some terminology that you'll hear me use as we go through this, and it's not meant to be derogatory, but the Passover is kept on 2 different days in Jewish circles and in some believers' messianic circles. The ones that keep it on the 14th are called 14ers. They were ultimately labeled quartodeciman by the Romans when we get to the 2nd and 3rd century CE. So there's something called a quartodeciman controversy. If you were to look that up, you would see that the Emperor Constantine was the one that ultimately decided when the quartodeciman controversy, he decided how it was to be concluded. And of course, that led to the Passover being changed to Sunday. But the quartodeciman controversy was all about the 14ers versus the Sunday keeping group. The 15ers, I don't think you see this too much in the records, but 14 is quarto and 15 is quinto. You know, quinto is 5 and deciman is 10. So I've just labeled myself the 15ers, quintodeciman, just to have some sense of cohesion here. And so you'll see that I'll use this terminology 14ers and 15ers as we go through, and it's not meant derogatorily at all. It's just putting a label on so we can identify things. And when we look at the 15ers, we see that there are some significant differences between them and the 14ers. The 15ers have one of the foundational anchors they use is John 19, verse 14. And this is really a compelling foundation because it's in conflict. It seems in conflict with the other 3 Gospels. Let me read John 19:14. And it was the preparation of the Passover and about the 6th hour, and Pilate said unto the Jews, Behold your king. So seems pretty evident here that if it's the preparation for the Passover, it couldn't be the actual day of the Passover, that the Passover was yet to come, and it was the 6th hour. Obviously, Yeshua has been crucified at this point. So the 15ers use this as, see here, that it says in John 19 that Yeshua was already hanging on the post, who was crucified, and Pilate is saying it's the preparation for the Passover. In other words, the previous night dinner that Yeshua had with the disciples could not have been it. The problem is there are 3 gospel accounts that say that it is. So you've got one account here that the 15ers like to use, and of course there has to be workarounds to how do you justify what Yeshua said on the 14th. And of course there's a whole series of workarounds for both sides of this question. Also, the 15ers say, as a result of John 19, that the Passover is at the end of the 14th going into the 15th. And you see that in Judaism today, that's exactly what they do. They have their Seder at the end of the 14th. If you search out Passover on the internet today, you'll find that, and you look at what goes on over in Israel and in Judaism, that next week, the Passover for them will be the 14th going into the 15th rather than the 13th going into the 14th. So that's a major difference, of course, and not only in Judaism, but in generally Messianic circles, you'll see that today. And the other trademark of the 15ers is that the Passover and the Exodus occur on the same night. In other words, the Israelites left Egypt the same night that they had the sacrifice, that they painted the blood on the doorpost to be redeemed, to have their firstborn being redeemed. And so that's something that the 15ers have to work around, and they have a good workaround for that. There's also a proof text in Deuteronomy 16, first 8 verses, and Ezekiel 45 that talks about what appears to be the Passover being on the 14th going into the 15th. And I'll just mention, there's parts and pieces that you have to be aware of all the way along here. And the account in Ezekiel 45, depending on the translation that you use, the translation we use as a comparison generally is the King James, not because it's better, but it's just well understood and it provides a good foundation and benchmark to compare to others. But if you look at Ezekiel 45, you see that there's a possibility that you could move the comma and change the meaning, or move the semicolon, I think, as it is. But punctuation is important but it's also not included in the original text. So punctuation is something that man has added, and according to a person's understanding, the punctuation might change the meaning. And here's a perfect example of that. If we compare what Yeshua said in Luke 23 and take a look at where the comma is, there's a significant change depending upon where you put the comma. And Yeshua said unto him, talking about the thief on the cross, or thief on the post, verily I say unto you, today shall you be with me in paradise. So this is a common mainstream Christianity belief system here. When you ask people about this, obviously he went to heaven that day. He went to heaven with Yeshua that day. Well, the problem is Yeshua didn't go to heaven that day. Yeshua was in the grave for 3 days, and we know that just by reading simply the account. So that comma was put there, but look what happens if you just move the comma. And Yeshua said unto him, verily I say unto you today, you shall be with me in paradise, meaning it's yet to come. So depending upon punctuation, the meaning of some of these verses can take a pretty different slant. So just beware of that as you read and study, and know that the punctuation wasn't ever a part of the original grammar. Now, the other part of this in terms of background is, what is the definition of this term between the evenings, or Ben Ha Arbayim? There's a couple of broad differences of understanding. One is it just after sunset, right after sunset, or is it the afternoon hours before sunset? Big difference. So there's some variations on the theme here. One variation on the afternoon is that it's the time from the zenith of the sun. When the sun is at noon, it's that time as the shadows start to grow until sunset. That's Ben Ha Arbayim, with in some 15ers perspectives. Some will have that. Or another perspective that you'll see is it's a midpoint. In other words, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon until sunset. And are any of those alternatives true? Or is it after sunset before complete dark? And of course, all this goes into, when is the Passover? When was really the Passover? Which is what we're examining here. Now, I have one caveat emptor, and I was delighted to find this in a book called The Passover in the Bible and the Church Today by Doctors Kuhn and Graby. And what they say, these are contemporary writers and researchers and scholars. They present themselves as scholars. So here's what they say, though, in their book. Any attempt to make the phrase between the two evenings, Ben Ha Arbayim, refer to the beginning of the 14th is contrary to all ancient scholarship known, and also goes against modern scholars who have discussed the subject. So I get a kick out of these kind of statements that people make. So if you are of the belief that this goes against all scholarship, you're going to have to maybe turn this off, because we're going to look at this alternative exactly that these two guys said is contrary to all ancient known scholarship. So we're going to examine this in spite of what they think it would be a fruitless attempt. So a couple of useful prerequisites going through this, because I know some people that ultimately listen to this that will be on our website. Others will listen to it over time. There's some prereqs that make sense that really can help you understand the fullness of this. First one certainly is the familiarization with the Old Testament, New Testament Passover accounts. If you're only familiar with the New Testament Passover accounts, in other words, you're probably mainstream Christian in your belief system, that's all good and well, but the New Testament Passover accounts were the result of the legislation and the the accounts that were given in the Old Testament. So knowing both sides of this, the Old Testament and New Testament, is very useful. An understanding, maybe not a detailed understanding, but understanding of the holy day, biblical holy day calendar. There's, again, a big controversy on several different calendar systems. And of course, the Gregorian system that we use today is simply man's calendar that was done by King Gregory back in the 15th century. So you can't rely on the calendar we have today to make any sense out of any of this. You've got to get back to the original scriptural calendar, which was a new moon calendar. And the new moon has variations depending upon which system you use. The calculated Hebrew calendar that's used today, that was originally developed back in the 3rd century, uses the dark moon conjunction as the starting point of the month. And then there's a whole nother school of thought that uses the first visible crescent as the starting point of the month. Sometimes that's the same, as it was this year, by the way. All the calendar systems seemed to line up this year, so there wasn't a discrepancy. But most years, people are keeping the Passover over a 2-day period of time, sometimes as much as 3, depending upon which calendar system they use. So knowing and understanding a little bit about that is certainly useful. And obviously, going into a subject like this, if you don't agree with the premises that we've started with here and what I'm going to present, you need to suspend, if you're going to listen to it, your any preconditions, any bias that you have. It's real easy to have prejudice. You know, prejudice is the easiest form of learning that a person can do. It doesn't take any homework, or it doesn't take any research. You can just have a prejudiced viewpoint and say that it's real. So you're going to have to suspend your prejudice or preconditions if you're going to give an honest look at this subject. And yet, I always say at the end of my presentations, those that have listened to them know that do your own homework. So I'm going to mention that up front on this. You need to have a desire, as it says in 2 Timothy, to study to show yourself approved unto Elohim, a workman that needs not be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. This is one of my favorites. I guess it's because we've done a lot of building projects here on our property for one reason or another. A chicken house or a barn or a woodshed or greenhouses or something. We're always building something. And Linda will probably tell you, I like rightly dividing the wood, making a straight cut. Dissecting. Is that true? She's shaking her head. Rightly dividing the word of truth and making a straight cut with it and dissecting the divine message correctly. And interestingly enough, it's the only place in the scriptures that this word for making a straight cut in the Greek is used. So you got to have a desire to do that. But let's go on. Let's get going here. So with all of that in mind, we're going to start with in the evening or at the evening. You find this form in English in a number of places in the Old and New Testament, for that matter. In the evening. Let's start with Exodus chapter 12. And what we're going to see is there are 2 Hebrew forms of this terminology, in the evening or at the evening, and they're used interchangeably in the English. The first form I want to talk about is in Exodus 12, verse 6. And you shall keep it up until the 14th day of the same month, talking about the lamb. And the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it in the evening. So what does that mean? And depending upon your translation, some translation might say kill it at even. Some will say in the evening, or there's a variation of ways the English translates this. And it turns out, if you, again, using the King James as the foundation, if you wanted to use, the NASB or some other, you just have to do the same comparison. It'll be similar. But in the evening, if you use that phrase in the King James, you find that there are 13 matches. What you don't know until you look is that there's a difference in what in the evening means and what period of time it's talking about. The alternative to this is another form that we find that's just at even. You would think that they would be the same, and in some cases they are, in some cases they aren't. But the second form we can find in one of the places in Deuteronomy 16, and there shall be no leavened bread seen with you in all your coast 7 days. Neither shall there anything of the flesh which you sacrifice the first day at even remain all night until the morning. And when you look at this phrase and do the comparison, you find out that there are 31 matches that come up throughout the Old Testament and the New. Notice each one of these has something in Mark that matches up to it. But in any case, if you just look this far, you really wouldn't know that there is a distinction and a difference between these two forms. So what we want to do is you have to be willing to look into a lexicon or a concordance and see what the construction is of these same scriptures with the Hebrew. So let's take a look at the same, we'll use the same comparison on the top, and I'll add one to it just so you understand. So you shall keep it to the 14th day of the month, meaning the lamb, the whole assembly shall kill it in the evening. And when we look at this in a lexicon, we see that in the evening is really two words. There's a preposition in the original Hebrew that's pronounced bain. And that word bain means distinction or between. It's actually used in, I think, several hundred places throughout the scriptures to mean a distinction in between, but a distinction in between about animals or about people, not just about dates. But when it's used in distinction with the evening, it's a specific phrase. It's something, you might think of it something like an idiom. So in Exodus 12, we see that bain goes along with Areb, which means dusk or night. This is where the term bain Ha Arbayim comes from, by the way. And another example of this that's translated at even has this same property. So in Leviticus 23, in the 14th day of the first month, bain Areb is Yahuwah's Passover. Now you might say, well, what difference does that make? It turns out that bain Ha Arbayim, which is this first form that I'm showing you, always includes this preposition H996, or the word bain. It can be translated in the evening, or it can be translated at even. So if you're using an English translation of your scriptures, you won't necessarily know what form of this idiom is taking place unless you look and see if the word bain is in front of Areb. Now, by contrast, we see a number of scriptures that don't use bain in front of Areb. And here's some examples of that. And there shall be no leavened bread seen with you in all your coasts 7 days. Neither shall there anything of the flesh which you sacrifice the first day at even remain all night until the morning. So you notice that the terminology here at even is the same as what we just read in Leviticus 23:5. The difference, though, is there is no bain. So only Areb, only dusk or night is identified here. So Yahuwah put the scriptures together with a tremendous amount of detail. Everything is there for a reason. So when you find something like this, it's not there just because Moses decided to add it, or Ezra, if he was doing their editing at the end, I'm not sure he was the one or not, but whoever edited it finally could add or take away bain. The fact that bain is here, when you look at how it's used in the other comparisons, you see that it definitely means a different point in time. It's a different part of the evening, distinct from just the evening. So when you see bain Ha Arbayim, it means something a little different than just Ba Arev, or just the word Arev for evening. Another comparison to this without bain in it is found in Exodus 16. And Moses said, "This shall be when Yahuwah shall give you in the evening flesh to eat, and in the morning bread to eat." No bain here. So you notice that the terminology at even and in the evening doesn't tell you what the construction is. I've given you examples on each side of this that show you that in one case, bain Ha Arbayim is given, and in the other case, just plain old Erev or Ba Erev is given. So when you look at the vanilla Ba Erev without bain, it does not include the preposition bain or H996. It can be translated in the evening or at even, just like bain Ha Arbayim can be translated. And it turns out that there are 22 matches of this. So we're going to look at the left side of this chart today. The next presentation in order, we're going to look at the right side. So we'll get our foundation with bain Ha Arbayim, and then we'll go to Ba Erev in the next session, which would be session number 6. Okay, so there are 11 matches that include this distinction of bain. And turns out bain means distinction, so maybe somewhat that's a play on words itself, but not intended. And there are 11 matches, and I'm going to read through them. When you see this yellow asterisk at the end of the scripture, that's one of the scriptures we're going to look at today. So there are actually 11 matches, and we're going to look at 8 of the matches in detail. So first one is first occurrence, Exodus 12:6, "And you shall keep it up until the 14th day of the same month, and the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it, bain Ha Arbayim." Number 2 is, "I have heard the murmurings of the children of Israel, speak unto them at even, bain Ha Arbayim. You shall eat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread, and you shall know that I am Yahuwah your Elohim." This one will be significant because this account shows us what the timing is of bain Ha Arbayim. So we'll come back to that. "The one lamb you shall offer in the morning, and the other lamb you shall offer at even, bain Ha Arbayim. And the other lamb you shall offer, bain Ha Arbayim, and shall do thereto according to the meat offering of the morning, and according to the drink offering thereof, for a sweet savor, an offering made by fire unto Yahuwah." And number 5, "When Aaron lights the lamps, bain Ha Arbayim, he shall burn incense upon it, a perpetual incense before Yahuwah throughout your generations." Number 6 is, "In the 14th day of the first month, bain Ha Arbayim is Yahuwah's Passover." So if you ran across a scripture that says in the 14th day, Ba Erev is Yahuwah's Passover, the timing might be different of what it's trying to tell us. It doesn't say that here. It says the 14th day of the first month, bain Ha Arbayim is Yahuwah's Passover. That's noteworthy. Number 7, we jump to the book of Numbers. "In the 14th day of this month, bain Ha Arbayim, you shall keep it in his appointed season, according to all the rites of it, and according to all the ceremonies thereof, shall you keep it." Number 8, they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the first month, bain Ha Arbayim, in the wilderness of Sinai, according to all that Yahuwah commanded Moses. So did the children of Israel. Continuing in Numbers, "The 14th day of the second month, bain Ha Arbayim, you shall keep it, and eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs." Numbers 28, "The one lamb shall you offer in the morning, and the other lamb shall you offer, bain Ha Arbayim." And the last one, number 11, "And the other lamb shall you offer, bain Ha Arbayim, as the meat offering of the morning, and as the drink offering thereof. You shall offer it a sacrifice made by fire, a sweet savor unto Yahuwah." So those are the 11 occurrences that you find of this phrase, bain Ha Arbayim. So we'll take a look at the first mention of this in Exodus chapter 12, and a bunch of details that will go along with it that will start to form a foundation of how Yahuwah originally told the Israelites to keep the Passover. So Exodus 12, "Speak you unto the children of Israel, saying, In the 10th day of this month, they shall take to them every man a lamb according to the house of their fathers, a lamb for a house. And if the household be too little for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next unto his house take it according to the number of souls. And it goes on to say, your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. You shall take it out from the sheep and from the goats, and you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation shall kill it. Kill it, bein Ha Arbayim. Kill it in the evening. And they shall take of the blood and strike it on the two side posts and on the upper doorpost of the houses wherein they shall eat. And you shall eat flesh in that night, roast with fire and unleavened bread. And the account goes on to say, eat not of it raw nor sodden at all with water, but roast with fire his head, his legs, and with the purtenance. So let's take a look at some of the details of this with a couple of comments. So there's some stipulations mentioned throughout this scripture. The first one, number one, that we see, a lamb for a house. One lamb per, it's for a house. It's for a domestic household. It's not for the tabernacle. It's for the domestic household. And the second item is that it's a male sheep or goat and no blems. So a sheep or a goat, no calves or oxen. This isn't the, the cattle Passover. It's sheep or goats. Keep it until the 14th day. And this is an interesting one because you don't have to look very far to see when that is. This is a huge clue by itself. Keep it until the 14th day. Now, some translations have tried to work around to this, but if you, again, look up the Hebrew, it's number 5704, and doesn't matter if you use Strong's or Brown Driver Briggs. Go take a look. Go search this out for yourself, and we'll come back to this point. But look what the keep it up until means as far as long as, even to. So this is a huge clue all by itself. You're going to keep it up until the 14th. That means up to the 14th, not to the end of the 14th, to the beginning. And I'll show you some comparative scriptures of how until is used in other places, which will cement this, the proof of this in your minds. So keep it until the 14th day of the month, and kill it, bein Ha Arbayim, not just Ba'arev, kill it Ba'arev, kill it bein Ha Arbayim. And the fifth point of this is to paint it around the domestic household doorway. Strike it on the two side posts and the upper door post of the houses, not on the temple altar, on the side post of the houses. Again, these are important distinctions. So these stipulations we will come back to as we go. The next one, though, number 6, is also an important, they're all important. So this shows us the pattern of how Yahuwah wanted the Israelites to keep this first Passover in Egypt before they left the next day, the next night, on their 40-year journey to the Promised Land. But you're supposed to roast it with fire. You roast it or bake it with fire. And the stipulation specifically shows us to do not eat it raw, nor sodden. So, and that word sodden means boil. So don't boil it all with water. You're not supposed to soften it up. Here it again says, but roast it. So if we start finding sacrifices that were boiled, they cannot fit this pattern of what Yahuwah told Moses to do in terms of keeping the Passover. And so you got to roast it. You can't be boiled in water. And you look a couple of verses later, starting in verse 14 in Exodus 12, back on the left side, you're to memorialize this event. Here's what it says, and this day shall be unto you for a memorial. It's a memento, a record. And it's like similar to the Day of Trumpets. Trumpets is a memorial day. Actually, all the feasts are memorials, but some of them are called out specifically. This is a memento or a record. It's a mark, something you should remember, and you shall keep it a feast to Yahuwah throughout your generations. Throughout. You shall keep it a feast or a hag by an ordinance forever. So did Yahuwah change it? I don't think he changed it. I don't think there's a case to be made to this. So we believe with these easy to see scriptures, like keep it throughout your generations and keep it as an ordinance forever. That's pretty easy for me to see that he meant us to continue to keep it in the same pattern. The sacrifice is going to change, that's for sure, but keep it in the same pattern. So with that, actually, I meant to show you on this page, kill it, keep it until the 14th. So let me go back to that. Keep it until the 14th. Here's the comparisons of the keeping it until the 14th. So use this same word that I mentioned, until, as far as long as, or even to. Here's some scriptures that use the same Hebrew word in a different context, but it certainly gives you the understanding of what until means. Genesis 8, and the waters decreased continually until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, were the tops of the mountains seen. So you can't continue much beyond the beginning of the month here, because specifically it says the 10th month and now the first day. So you certainly couldn't build the case that until meant to the end of the month or the middle of the month. It's to the very first day. It's what it says in context. Genesis 32, and Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. Did that wrestling go on after the day? It says until the breaking of the day, the beginning of the day. And 2 Samuel, and Mephibosheth, the son of Saul, came down to meet the king, and had neither dressed his feet, nor trimmed his beard, nor washed his clothes from the day the king departed until the day he came again in peace. So these definitions all ought to be pretty clear. This is at the beginning of these periods of time, not at the end of these periods of time. So let's go on here. In the next example that we're going to use is Exodus 16. This example has significance in several ways, and it really is just a month after the original Passover, but the event has to do, normally people read this, and I've read this and explained it, has to do with the institution of the Sabbath. I'll call it the reinstitution, because the Sabbath was created back in Genesis at the creation chapter in Genesis 1. The Israelites, though, had forgotten the Sabbath. That's why it says, remember the Sabbath day. And maybe that's a good reminder for today. Remember the Sabbath day, that you shall keep it. And it's the only one of the commandments that starts like that. Remember it. It's written as if you forgot it, which most have today forgotten it. But this account in Exodus 16, 1 month after what we just read in Exodus 12, shows us the reinstitution of the Sabbath, but it also, when you examine it closely, shows us the difference between Ha Arbayim and Ba'arev, these two forms of this Hebrew idiom that I've talked about a couple of charts back. So we find both forms of Ba'arev and Ha Arbayim in this scripture, and it's notable how they are woven together to show us what they mean. So let's go through it. On the 15th day of the second month, it goes on to say, the whole congregation of the children of Israel murmured against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And it goes on to say, then said Yahuwah unto Moses, behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain rate every day, that I may prove them. So here's the beginning of the Sabbath definition. And it goes on, and it shall come to pass that on the 6th day they shall prepare that which they bring in, and it shall be twice as much as they gather daily. So when you read the rest of the context of this, and if you haven't seen this, you'll have to probably look at it on your own and study it on your own to whether these things be so. But the 6 days starts tomorrow, not, not 2 weeks from Tuesday, it starts tomorrow. And Moses and Aaron said unto the children of Israel, Ba'arev, at even. This is notable, Ba'arev, not Bein Ha Arbayim, but Ba'arev, then you shall know that Yahuwah has brought you out from the land of Egypt. And in the morning, which is Boker, the dawn or the break of the day, then you shall see the glory of Yahuwah. For that he hears your murmurings against Yahuwah. And what are we that you murmur against us? And Moses said, this shall be when Yahuwah shall give you Ba'arev, flesh to eat, when he's going to give it to you, Ba'arev, flesh to eat, and in the morning at Boker, bread to eat, for that Yahuwah hears your murmurings which you murmur against him. And what are we? Your murmurings are not against us, but against Yahuwah. So what we know is at even, and I'm going to show you that means sunset. At sunset and at sunrise, you're going to have both meat and you're going to have bread. So the manna and the quails are given at evening. And we're going to see specifically when the Israelites ate, they first were given the quails and then they ate it. And of course, this is after the reinstitution of the Sabbath. Keep in mind that Yahuwah isn't going to break his own Sabbath. He's not going to bring quails if the day of the 15th is the Sabbath, which it is, and 7 days from this account is the Sabbath, which it is, and when you read it in context, that's what you see. Then the day of the 15th, Yahuwah isn't going to bring the quails. He's going to bring it at sunset. And that's what he says he's going to do. At even or at sunset, Ba'arev, I'm going to bring the quails to you. And I'm going to bring the bread at dawn. Okay, and then dawn obviously is going to be the next day. It's going to be the 16th, the first day count of the 6th to get to the following Sabbath. So going on in Exodus 16 in this account, Moses said unto Aaron, say unto all the congregation of the children of Israel, come near before Yahuwah, for he has heard your murmurings. And it came to pass, as Aaron spoke unto the congregation of the children of Israel, that they looked toward the wilderness. And behold, the glory of Yahuwah appeared in the cloud. Look, it's coming on the horizon right now. And Yahuwah spoke unto Moses, saying, I have heard the murmurings of the children of Israel. Speak unto them, saying. So listen carefully. Speaks unto them, saying. Bein Ha Arbayim is now inserted here. Speak unto them, saying, Bein Ha Arbayim, you shall eat flesh. And in the morning, Boker again, you shall be filled with bread. And you shall know that I am Yahuwah your Elohim. And it came to pass that Ba'arev, the quails came up and covered the camp. And in the morning, or Boker, the dew lay on the ground about the host. Goes on to talk about there lay a small round thing, as small as the hoar frost on the ground. And it goes on, and it came to pass that on the 6th day they gathered twice as much bread. And it ends up here, and he said unto them, that is that which Yahuwah has said. Tomorrow is the rest of Yahuwah, of the holy Sabbath unto Yahuwah. So do you get what's being talked about here? The quails are delivered at Ba'arev, but you're not going to eat until at even you shall eat. But it's Bein Ha Arbayim, you're going to eat. So this tells us exactly when these two phrases come into play. Dinner preparation has to occur before you can eat. So the quails are delivered Ba'arev at even. immediately after the Sabbath day, by the way. But then after after Ba'arev, you're able to eat them Bein Ha Arbayim. That turns out to be a window of time, and I'm going to show you what it looks like. So Bein Ha Arbayim, you get to go collect. There's more to do here than just take the quails that fall out of the air and then eat them. I mean, you got a little bit of work to do here. You got to go collect the quails, and it's going to be after sunset. You got to dress them out. You got to pluck the feathers and, dress the birds. It's not going to take too long, though. These are pretty small birds. We've dressed a lot of birds here, a lot of chickens, so we kind of understand this process. But small bird like this, you probably could dress out in, 20, 30 minutes at the most, and have it on a stick, cooking it on the fire pretty quickly. So they won't take long to cook either. Probably, an hour or so after you start the process, maybe an hour and 15 minutes, you could be eating. And these people were hungry, so they were probably motivated to do it as quickly as possible. And of course, the manna is in the morning. And what we see here is, we're starting to see, I hope, is that Bein Ha Arbayim is a period of time after sunset, but before dark. That's what you should start to see here. At least that's what I see. And of course, you have to do your own homework, decide whether this be so. Now, we put it on a little 2-day calendar chart. When is dinner? So what we just learned is, first thing that happens is at even, the quails came up. At even is at dusk or at night in the terminology here. I think you have to say the quails came up, though, at the end of the day, at the very end of the day, going into the next day. When sunset occurred is when the quails came up. You also would have to say that the quails would have to come up before you could dress them and cook them and eat them. So this period of time, Bein Ha Arbayim, is addressing the period of time after that, refers to the transition period of night. And then the next morning, of course, after sunrise, you're going to be filled with bread. That's not the purpose of our dialogue here, but you see that as ultimately what happens. Now, I want to digress just briefly into some astronomy. Astronomy has always been one of my favorite sciences, but we look at Astronomy 101, and it happens to match up very nicely and precisely. The scriptures match up with Astronomy 101 is probably the better way to say it. What is sunset in astronomy, also known as sundown? Well, it's defined as the daily disappearance of sun below the horizon due to the Earth's rotation. It's not the sun that's really moving around the Earth is moving around the sun, and the Earth is spinning on its axis. So it appears that the sun is going over the horizon, but it's really the Earth spinning. But the disappearance of the sun due to the Earth's rotation. And the orientation of the sunset is dependent upon where you are. At the equator, the sun sets exactly due west in both spring and autumn. And if you live more in middle latitudes, we're kind of on the northern latitude side of things, but if you live in middle latitudes, the local summer sun sets to the southwest if you're in the northern hemisphere. But if you're in the southern hemisphere, it sets to the northwest. So depending upon which side of the equator you're on, depends on where you see the sunset from your perspective. Also, the timing of sunset varies throughout the course of the year. And it's certainly fair to say that the sunset and the timing is determined by the viewer's longitude, latitude, and the elevation. How far are you in the mountains, or are you at the seacoast, or whatever? That determines how you see the sunset. And there's also a change seasonally, an incremental daily and seasonal change, which is driven by the axial tilt of the Earth. The Earth is 23 degrees on its axis, which causes the seasons, and the daily rotation of the Earth on its axis causes the sunset to appear. And the location of the Earth's location in the elliptical orbit around the sun has an effect on when you see the sunset. So you probably noticed that during the winter and spring, the days get longer and sunsets occur later each day until you get to the summer solstice. And when you get to the summer solstice, then it starts retrograde, going back the days get shorter. until you get to the winter solstice. So all of that's just basic astronomy. As a reference, if you were at about 25 degrees north latitude, your sunset's going to last about 3 minutes from the time the sun touches the horizon to the time it goes over the horizon. And that time it goes over the horizon is Ba Arev. That's sunset, Ba Arev. So with that explanation in mind, let's take a little deeper look with this model of astronomical sunset and astronomical twilight. The sunset is the moment when the upper limb of the sun disappears below the horizon. So I've highlighted that in red here. As soon as the sun goes over the horizon, as it did on the right-hand side of that previous chart I was on, that's sunset astronomically. I would argue that that's Ba Arev. Ba Arev also, though, by the way, could be the entire night, but Ba Arev is defined, which you see in the scriptures. Yahuwah said he's going to have the birds come at Ba Arev. So that meant that it's going to come after sunset. And it's, comes over a few minutes, I'm sure, but birds weren't falling out of the air for the next 6 hours. The birds came, they fell out of the air. The Israelites had to go dress them and eat them. So sunset was the time, Ba Arev, that Yahuwah delivered these quails. The moment when the upper limb of the sun disappears below the horizon. And then sunset is distinct, though, from twilight from an astronomical standpoint. I would say also from a scriptural standpoint. And the twilight astronomically is divided into 3 stages. It's interesting to see that, because that same terminology is what we're seeing in Bein Ha Arbayim. The 3 stages of twilight are, first, the civil twilight begins once the sun has disappeared below the horizon and continues until it descends to 6 degrees. So these are measurements. These aren't scriptures. These are just measurements that man has made, but the scriptures line up with this. The nautical twilight is the next 6 degrees, when the sun is between 6 and 12 degrees below the horizon. And the final twilight is called astronomical twilight. It's the sun between 12 and 18 degrees below. Once you get to that point, you're at dark. So, everybody knows that it doesn't go from the sun shining to absolute dark. It transitions over a period of time. And the dusk, the astronomical dusk, is the very end of the astronomical twilight. It's the darkest moment of twilight just before dusk. And the night then occurs after the sun reaches 18 degrees below the horizon and no longer illuminates the sky. This transition obviously takes place from your vantage point. Sometimes it's shorter period, sometimes it's longer period, given the variables I told you: longitude, latitude, altitude, point in the orbit around the sun, or the season of the year. So all this is taken into effect. Now, when we apply this to what we see in Exodus chapter 16, we have the 15th day of the month, which is a Sabbath day. You know that from studying that scripture, and looking at that scripture. At least I believe that's what it says, and many others do too. And then you saw the account where it said at even, at Ba Arev, the quails came up and covered the camp. So here's when the quails came up, they covered the camp. After the 15th, the transition is now into the 16th, and we are into this twilight period of time. The next thing that happened is that you're going to eat the flesh. Yahuwah said you're going to be able to eat it. So after the quails are delivered, you're able to eat it. This is the period of time that's called Bein Ha Arbayim. You see that it's a period of time, and it lines up nicely with this twilight definition in astronomy. Now, I want to go to the next scripture in Numbers 9 that talks about Bein Ha Arbayim. Remember, I said I was going to look at 8 of the 11. So with what we've learned so far, we should be able to go on to Numbers 9 and have a sense of when Bein Ha Arbayim is versus Ba Arev. So this account takes place in the first month and the second year of the Exodus. First month, second year, and that's important to remember this. And let's read Numbers 9, and then we'll talk about it. Yahuwah spoke unto Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the first month of the second year, after they were come out of the land of Egypt, saying, let the children of Israel also keep the Passover at his appointed time. In the 14th day of this month, Ha Arbayim is what the Hebrew says, you shall keep it in his appointed season. According to all the rites, the customs and the ordinances of it, and according to all the ceremonies thereof, shall you keep it. And Moses spoke unto the children of Israel that they should keep the Passover. And they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the first month, Ha Arbayim, in the wilderness of Sinai, according to all that Yahuwah commanded Moses, so did the children of Israel. So here's 1 year later, after the first Passover, they're keeping the second Passover. And they're keeping the Passover, it's at Sinai. And how are they living? They're living in tents. And you'll notice that there's not a tabernacle sacrifice mentioned here. To keep it according to the same ceremonies. I meant to bring this pop-up window here to show you that they were living in. How do you know they were living in tents? There's some number of scriptures that show you that, but here's just one in Leviticus 14. And he that is to be cleansed shall wash his clothes and shave off all his hair and wash himself in water that he may be clean. And after that he shall come into the camp and shall tarry abroad out of his tent 7 days. So here Leviticus was written at Mount Sinai, which is where they were, because it says in the wilderness of Sinai, and it's the second year. So they got to Sinai on effectively the third month of their journey, and when Pentecost occurred, and they're living in tents. And the account says to keep the Passover according to all the rites and customs of it. What do you think the rites and the customs of it were? Well, it was given to Moses and to the Israelites 1 year previous, a little over 1 year, 1 year previous at the Passover in Egypt. So they're going to keep it the same way the second year that they were on their journey as they did the first year. Keep it the same way. Exodus 12:6 says, and you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. The whole congregation shall kill it in the evening, Ha Arbayim. So they're going to do the same thing this time that they did the first time when they were still in Egypt. And if you look at this word for evening in the lexicons, one of the lexicons that you probably should look at, Strong's is the easy one. Brown Driver Briggs is a little less common, but it's certainly an excellent Hebrew English lexicon. If you look at Ba'arev, or just the word for evening, it's H6153. And evening or sunset is what it means. Evening, originally sunset, and hence perhaps at the time of sunset. And it also says that it's dual in phrase. Ha Arbayim means between the two evenings, probably between sunset and dark. So here's a highly respected lexicon, Brown Driver Briggs, that brings out this terminology, Ha Arbayim. They say probably it means between sunset and dark. I mean, just what I showed you on the Astronomy 101 charts. So going on from here, though, there were certain men who were defiled by the dead body of a man. So fundamentally, this account's going to show us that they couldn't keep the Passover on the appointed time, and they had to wait a month. So this is that account. That they could not keep the Passover on that day. It goes on to say, Yahuwah spoke to Moses, saying, speak unto the children of Israel, saying, if any man of you or your posterity shall be unclean by reason of a dead body, or be in a journey afar off, yet he shall keep the Passover unto Yahuwah. the 14th day of the second month, Bein Ha Arbayim, they shall keep it, and eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They shall leave none of it until the morning, nor break any bone of it. According to all the ordinance of the Passover, they shall keep it. So this is pretty interesting account. So if you're going to miss the first one because you're not Kodesh, and you keep the second one 1 month later, keep it according to the same pattern as the first one. And they kept it as a domestic household Passover. It's that term that I said I would bring up. I think you'd have to say that's what's being talked about here, domestic household Passover. There's no indication here that the tabernacle is involved in this. The tabernacle was up and available, and I'll show you the proof of that in a minute. So this would have been a perfect opportunity if Yahuwah would have wanted to change the Passover service and sacrifice to the tabernacle, ultimately to the temple later on. This would have been a perfect time to do it, but the instructions are to do it originally as you have been doing it. So the second Passover uses the original ordinances. What are they? Well, when we started out, I said I'm going to come back to them. So the domestic household Passover sacrifice includes, in the 10th day of this month, take to them every man a lamb. Did they do that here? I think they probably did. Take it according to the number of your souls. According to his eating shall you make count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. Take it from the sheep or from the goats. There's no Passover oxen. In other words, no Passover cow, sheep or goats. Keep it up until the 14th day of the same month. Kill it in the evening. Bein Ha Arbayim. Strike blood on the two side posts and upper door post of the houses wherein they shall eat it. Eat the flesh in that night. Roast it with fire, unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Eat not of it raw, nor sodden at all with water. All these are the instructions, if you recall. Roast it with fire, his head and his legs, and with the purtenance. We believe that's all the insides. It's pretty interesting to roast it with all its purtenances. You don't have to dress it. Interestingly enough, we've heard some people try to tell us that you take all the pertinence out and then you only put that which is pertinent back in, and then you roast it. I will tell you, you cannot do that with a lamb. I can tell you firsthand, you cannot do that. We dress lambs here, and once you dress it, you can't put it back together. It just doesn't work. And let none of it remain until the morning. That which remains, you shall burn with fire. So here's the original legislation. I think Yahuwah is telling them to keep it just as they did. I think this means that they must have painted blood on the doorways to their tents. It doesn't say that, but I think that's the insinuation. If you're going to keep it as you did, he didn't say not to do that, so keep it as it was. The other real interesting thing about this account here in number 6 is we know precisely when it is. We know it's the second year and the first month, and it's Passover, so that's the 14th day. And we also know it's the second month and the 14th day. The tabernacle was reared up on the second year and the first month. So the tabernacle is operational. Here's what it says in Exodus 40. And it came to pass in the first month, in the second year, on the first day of the month that the tabernacle was reared up, it became operational. So 2 weeks before the previous chart that I had in Numbers 9, that the tabernacle had been operational for 2 weeks, and there was no change to include the tabernacle, the temple, or the tabernacle Passover at this point in time. Of course, the temple was a later development, but the tabernacle certainly could have been used at this point if Yahuwah had wanted it to be used. Obviously, you probably know where I'm going with this. Once you finally get to the 1st century CE, the Passover sacrifices were done at the temple by that point in time. So we'll examine the history of how it got to be that way, but here's how it started. Here was the genesis of it, if you will, and how Yahuwah originally had it developed. Now, I have a few secular references, and these certainly aren't scriptural, but they're interesting to have looked at and to research, and as part of what has unfolded with doing the research on this topic. This man, Giovanni Vergiano Schiaparelli, is a real interesting guy. I ran across him looking into the astronomy of all of this. And turns out that he was born in Milan, Italy. He lived from 1835 to 1910, so fundamentally the middle end part of the 19th century. And he was an Italian astronomer and science historian. He's a real interesting person just to look up and read who he was. You can find a good article about him in Wikipedia to get an understanding of who he is. But he was a science guy, and he did extensive studies on the planets, particularly the first 3-4 planets, Mercury, Venus, and Mars. Of course, Earth being in the middle of that, but after Venus. But he studied them with the limited telescopic tools that he had of the day. And he was the one that actually discovered and wrote about the canals on Mars. So if anybody has remembered from school days, the canals on Mars, it was thought that there was water on Mars in the beginning because it looked like there was a canal structure that was made by man, but turns out, of course, that wasn't true after we got better resolution telescopes. But he was the first one, Schiaparelli was the first one that talked about that. And interestingly, what I discovered about him is he studied astronomy of the ancient Hebrews and Babylonians. Oh, well, that's interesting. So I went about to find out where he had written about that. And he wrote a book called Astronomy in the Old Testament. So right down the line of things I like to look at. So let me read an account on page 93 of his book. Accordingly, on the evening of the new moon, the duration of twilight from the moment of the crescent's appearance is divided into 2 unequal parts, which the Jews called the 2 evenings, or in Hebrew, Arbayim. The first evening formed an interval of about half an hour, during which, as it was still sufficiently light to be considered as a continuation and part of the preceding day, the common occupations of the day could be attended to. In other words, this is sunset. He attributes sunset to be about a half an hour here, and it's still part of the same previous day for the first half hour or so. That interval, in fact, which we call the twilight of the civil day. The second evening lasting nearly an hour. And goes on to say in his writing, in the Pentateuch, we find use made several times of the expression Ben Ha Arbayim, between the 2 evenings, to indicate the moment which separated the 2 periods described above and marked for the Jews the beginning of the civil and religious day. So fundamentally, he's saying what I tried to show you astronomically. There's 2 separate parts. There's a sunset that starts the evening, and then there's a period of time called Bein Ha Arbayim, which is the twilight period. Now, the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia has a good reference also that I've included. There are many others, by the way, but I tried to use the ones that were probably most significant. And what the encyclopedia says, the transition of day to night begins before sunset and lasts till after sunset. The change of night to day begins before sunrise and continues until after sunrise. In both cases, neither a Reb or evening nor Boker morning indicates an exact space of time. And there's comparisons here if you cared to look at them. The term Neshef is used for both evening twilight and morning dawn. And there's some comparisons of that. Since there were no definite measurements of the time of the day, the various periods were indicated by the natural changes of the day. Thus, midday was the time of the day when the sun mounted its highest, Kohoreim. Afternoon was that part of the day when the sun declined, Netahayim. And evening was the time of the going down of the sun, Areb. Between the evenings, Bein Ha Arbayim, was the interval between sunset and darkness. according to the International Standard Encyclopedia. So they define it, and they show here that Bein Ha Arbayim, the period of time from sunset till dark. This is exactly what we've been talking about. Now, this period of time, Neta Hayam, is in the scriptures. And I'll just read the account. So some of these things could be researched and taken into further details in Judges. And he rose early in the morning on the 5th day to depart. And the damsel's father said, "Comfort your heart, I pray you." And they tarried until afternoon, Neta Hayam, and they did eat. So we find this one reference here, and I didn't want to include all the other references just because of space. So and here's a good account in the International Standard Encyclopedia. Now, probably the best one that I discovered came out of, I think originally I found it in the Jewish Encyclopedia, but it's a guy named Gunther Plaut. Gunther Plaut is a very interesting person, and he wrote a book called The Torah. And so I went and bought it because I saw enough about it that really captured my interest. And wow, what a novel he has written. And here's what he said about his commentary about this period of time in Passover. What you find if you go check this book out of your local library, or if you go buy it and get it, it's what we would call the Torah, the 5 books of the law as it's been coined today, as the terminology is. So he takes the 5 books, goes through them scripture by scripture, both in English and in Hebrew, and he has a commentary about the whole Torah. So it's very interesting. But here's what he said about Passover. The festival that in Jewish history has become known as Passover or Pesh received its character and importance through the Exodus, which made a pre-existing festival into the celebration of deliverance. Most precisely, there were probably 3 and certainly 2 separate observances which the Torah tradition combined into one great feast, and which subsequent generations endowed with unique distinction. Combined into one great feast. So he sees this. And that's indeed what you find when you go, by the time you get through, if you listen to all this material that I'm going to present, you will say it's been separate institutions combined into one feast. Though the Passover sacrifice is commanded as a prophylactic rite in connection with the impending Exodus, something that heals people and saves people, the occasion is to be remembered as the Feast of Unleavened Bread, matzah, or plural matzah. This double nomenclature can be explained best by supposing that the Passover and Feast of Matzah rituals were originally 2 separate observances, which were combined sometime between the events of the Exodus and the redaction of the text. The Feast of Matzah was an agricultural festival that celebrated the beginning of the grain harvest, when an offering of the first fruits was made and unleavened bread eaten. And then going on in his writing, the festival started on the 15th of Nisan. The Passover sacrifice was observed on the 14th of Nisan at eventide, and he quotes Leviticus 23:5, and was a thanksgiving rite of nomadic or semi-nomadic background. In the time, the propinquity of the 2 dates obscured and then eliminated the distinction, so that matzah became to be eaten in conjunction with the sacrifice. At first, the sacrifice was brought privately by each family, but later on, Jerusalem became the center of the celebration. Thank you, Mr. Gunther Plaut. Okay, one final view of Bein Ha Arbayim is about the morning and the evening sacrifice. So what I've centered our attention on at this point so far had to do with the Passover itself. Bein Ha Arbayim, though, is associated with the morning and the evening sacrifices as well. And if you've looked at the morning and evening sacrifices, when are they? Well, if you're a 15er, you build, one of the foundations is that they build the case that Ben Ha Arbayim is in the afternoon, so that the evening sacrifice really takes place late in the afternoon. And I think by now you can probably see that doesn't work out so well. You know, Yahuwah's an Elohim of consistency. You're going to do something at morning and you're going to do something at evening. The separation between the two on a daily basis is probably going to be on our calendar about, our clock, about 12 hours difference. You know, the day wasn't divided into 24 hours until relatively recent history. The Israelites didn't have 24-hour clock, but you know, the morning sacrifice is going to be about 12 hours later than the previous one, and the evening sacrifice about 12 hours later. It's not going to be, you know, 7 or 8 hours later. It's going to be probably split in about half. I mean, that's just the way Yahuwah does things. That's what these scriptures in Numbers 28 are about, and I'm only reading the highlights of them, not the detail. So the daily morning and evening sacrifices that we're talking about here are at Moab. By the time we get to Numbers 28, the Israelites are, you know, 39 in their 40th year of their wanderings in the desert, and they're getting ready to go into the promised land, but they are at Moab at this point. And Numbers 28 says, the one lamb you shall offer in the morning, and the other lamb you shall offer Bein Ha Arbayim. And Numbers 28:8 amplifies this. The other lamb shall you offer at Bein Ha Arbayim, as the meat offering of the morning, and as the drink offering thereof, you shall offer it, a sacrifice made by fire of a sweet savor unto Yahuwah. So what you find is there's these 11 examples end in Numbers. You only find the examples in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. There are no examples of Bein Ha Arbayim after that. And I believe this is the last one in the list. In any case, this is the 8th of the 11 that I wanted to look at. And when we again put it on the astronomical model, we see that the sacrifice was to occur after sunset, just as it was on the other side after the morning starts, after sunrise. You know, later as the full day goes by, the sacrifice was done Bein Ha Arbayim, which would be this twilight period of time. And frankly, that would make that, to me, that it's intuitively logical that that's when it would be anyway. It wouldn't be before the sun sets. It's going to be after the sun sets. So you can do your own research on this. But we look at what's the summary of all this and what we've looked at so far. So we've obviously been focusing on between the evenings, Ben Ha Arbayim. We've looked at 8 of the 11 references, and this refers to the time just after sunset until dark. It's, you might call it the twilight or the dusk period astronomically, and but it's the period of time after the sun goes over the horizon, but before it gets dark, finally black dark. And the astronomical sunset is a real favorable model with the scriptures. So I was glad to find some of these charts to help explain it. And I think the astronomical model is a good way to emphasize how this really looks. Now, we've also introduced this topic of the domestic household Passover. And you're going to see in the subsequent presentations, we will talk about the temple Passover sacrifice. So what we're going to see is there's an evolution of the sacrifice from the domestic household to the temple over a period of time. We're going to examine Hezekiah and Josiah's Passover, as well as the probably was Zerubbabel's. It doesn't say for sure that it was Zerubbabel's, but you find it in the book of Ezra. We'll look at that in a subsequent presentation. But the domestic household Passover sacrifice originally was on the beginning of the 14th, Bein Ha Arbayim, and it was administered at twilight, the dusk. It wasn't administered in the afternoon. There's no evidence that you can see here without bending things that it was in the afternoon. Yes, it later became implemented in the afternoon, but the original legislation was the evening, and it was performed at a home base. It wasn't performed at the tabernacle or the temple. There was no evidence that we have seen so far to change the sacrifice from a domestic household to a tabernacle or a temple sacrificial system. And we've looked at some interesting secular references showing us that the good opinion of these authors is that the Passover and the days of unleavened bread were originally two separate observances and that they were gradually combined over time. So, as is my mantra, you must do your own homework. Don't believe it because I said it. Go do your own homework and take a look at these matters. In Proverbs 30, it says, every word of Eloah is pure. It's refined. He is a shield unto them that put their trust in him. And add thou not unto his word. Add thou not unto his words. I pray I'm not adding to his words, lest he reprove you and you be found a liar. I've asked him to show me, and I pray that he has. Many others, though, have taken these same scriptures and seemingly added to the words. And so the admonition is, do your own study and don't add to the words. If I'm wrong, don't listen anymore. But do have an open mind and go look and review and make your own decision on this. Now, I've put a couple of probably the most significant references. I was going to have a whole page of references, but for purposes of just this final do your own homework chart, if you wanted to look at the two varying opinions of this controversy, is it the 15th or is it the 14th for the Passover, there are two references that you could look at. This one by this guy named Tennant, the messianicfeast.com, at that address. He's a 15er, so it's a good argument. If you only read his argument, you would say he's probably right. If that's all you did, he's skilled in his writing, and it's a good argument and well done. The alternative, I would say, would be Fred Coulter's The Christian Passover, found at his website at cbcg.org. He's a 14er and has also a compelling argument and a very detailed, compelling argument. So these might be a couple of alternatives if you're interested in taking a look at the alternatives. So next time, we will focus on the other half of the equation that I started with, which was Ba'arev. We put our attention on Vein Ha Arbayim this time. Next session, which will be next Thursday on the first day of unleavened bread, we will look at Ba'arev, the evening. What does that mean, and what are the examples we find in the scripture? And where do we, how do we apply what we've learned so far? We will examine Deuteronomy 16. First 8 verses are all about Passover, and most people think it's about Passover. I think I'm going to be able to show you, once we examine it, that it's really about the first day of unleavened bread. It's not about Passover. It's about the first day of unleavened bread. And we'll start to see how the Passover and the days of unleavened bread were combined with an examination of the Passovers of Hezekiah, Josiah, and then the one after the exile written about in Ezra, which would probably be the Passover that Zerubbabel conducted early on when the exiles came back out of captivity in Babylon and in Persia. So that's what we have coming up. May Yahuwah bless your Passover preparation and guide us all and lead us to the truth. And may we honor Yeshua. He's the one that's important. I would certainly want to mention the importance of Yeshua. He is the only name by which we may be saved. He's the reason for the Passover. And the reason we are honoring this day is in Yeshua's honor, and we glorify him and his name and ask that he be with us and guide us. So until next time, Yahuwah be with you. So thank you, our Father, for this day. We honor you and ask your blessing and your guidance and your direction on this Passover season, and help us examine ourselves that we may be worthy to come before you. Certainly, may we watch to be worthy to escape the things that are ahead and to stand before Yeshua when he returns on this earth. So thank you, though, for this day. Thank you for your wonderful holy day schedule, your appointed times, the feasts that are coming up and this time of year. So we ask your blessing, your guidance, and your direction, and your protection for the saints around this earth. And we honor you, our Father, in Yeshua's name. Amen.
I used to think we had all the time we need to plow the field and plant the seed. But now I realize that the darkest skies say night is stealing on. While we wait, it's growing late till day is gone. Say not tomorrow, I'll hold to the plow. There's no time to borrow. It's summer now. Million reach out for mercy's hand, while you're still searching for someone to till the land. So many die, never knowing why he came, like falling rain, and we're all to blame. Yet in his nail-scarred hands there's a deed to a land of abundant yield, and he seeks for you to join the few and work the field. Say not tomorrow, I'll hold to the plow. There's no time to borrow. It's summer now. The helpless million reach out for mercy's hand. You're still searching for someone to till the land. Say not tomorrow, I'll hold to the plow. There's no time to borrow. It's summer now. The helpless million reach out for mercy's hand. You're still searching for someone to till the land, till the
I was reading through the Bible of the saints who've gone before. Their names and deeds are written for to learn not to ignore. There I coat of many colors, I learned of the life of Job. Then I heard the voice of Moses say, let my people go. It was through him Yahweh blessed us with his statutes and his laws. And I marvel how they managed without assistance or applause. Then I came to Joshua, who led them to the promised land, and Samuel, who blessed David to be king by Yah's command. There's the story when Elijah mocked the priests of Baal that day, proving Yahweh rules the heavens and he answers when we pray. Daniel tells how Yahweh kept him safe inside the lion's den and protected his 3 brothers from the ploy of evil men. Then we come to dear sweet Mary and how she received the news of the coming of Messiah to be King of all the Jews. And we read of Peter, James, and John by the Sea of Galilee, and how they obeyed the Master who said, come and follow me. At midnight in a prison we hear Paul and Silas sing, though in pain and shackles they are happy children of the King. There are more that we could speak of if we only had the time.